G'day, I'm Owen, and this is episode 3 in the official Pub Test podcast. Now, if you're a regular to the Pub Test, you would know that a lot of content is to do with Jack the Ripper, and the podcast is a bit of a break away from it, and yet in this one, there is a significant amount of crossover. As we are looking at the French Ripper. Now, what's suggested to me that I look at this particular event as a possible Jack the Ripper suspect as well, but I just want to state categorically here that just isn't the case. There are some similarities, and we will be mentioning them, but there's a lot of things different to do with the French Ripper and the perpetrator of the crimes in Whitechapel. But in this one, viewer discretion is definitely advised. Now, I don't go into the real gory details of situations yet. You will understand the concepts of what happened to some of these people, and if certain topics affect your mental health, then look after yourself and maybe skip this particular episode because it is rather brutal. But the official events to do with the French Ripper happened all across France in 1894 to 1897. And yes, the attacks and crimes dotted across the entire map of France. So this was only 6 or so years after Jack the Ripper disappeared. Supposedly had been caught. Yet Jack the Ripper worked in a very localized area. And as we've mentioned, the French Ripper really knew no boundaries other than the country of France. And as mentioned, some of these crimes are just absolutely horrendous, and it is important just to go through a couple of them so we can understand the nature of the person as well as the feeling of the locals back there, because that really does play a part towards the end. But let's first set the scene. What was life like in France during the years of 1894 to 1897? Well, France, after 1871, after a bit of a conflict over there, and a lot of parts of Paris had been destroyed, it went through what is known as the Belle Epoque, if I've pronounced that correctly, but it means the beautiful era. And that meant that there was a massive amount of cultural growth, for one thing. People like Edgar Degas, he became prominent, as well as so many other artists and painters, and there was opera, so all sorts of creative people were starting to flourish. They also built the Eiffel Tower during this Belle Epoque. They set up the Paris Metro. They built the Opera House, whatever that might be. I'm thinking of the Sydney Opera House, but you understand what I mean. Tremendous growth was happening in France, but it wasn't just that. They were really advancing medical science. And other industries were really pushing forward. That France had 3 of what we probably call today the World Expos happened during this Belle Epoque. So they hosted those events, and people from all around the world came to learn the new innovations that was coming out of France. So the people there were at peace and they were prospering. Well, that was in the cities. The rural community may not have seen these years the same way as their city cousins. Now, I live in a rural area, so I think I'm a little bit qualified to comment on this. Sometimes cities don't see the struggles in the bush, as we call it in Australia. Because if there's a drought, they're probably okay for food for a while. But that drought impacts the farmer's livelihood immediately. If there's other disasters, maybe diseased crops, floods, anything could happen. And this farmer, and the farmers back there were not rich. They didn't necessarily own massive tracts of land like large-scale farming we see today. And so they were really relying constantly on their seasonal crops and produce and animals. And if that didn't happen, well, that meant that they were probably struggling to feed their families. And also mental health. Now, whilst France was making great advances in how to treat people with mental health issues, they still had that same problem that was probably all around the world at the time. They didn't have enough facilities to care for all the people that needed treatment. And therefore, if you went into a facility, the pressure was on you to ship them out, like get them cured and get back out on the street so you can bring someone else in that needs some treatment. The problem is a lot of these people being let out really had nowhere to go, and they certainly weren't cured. And so what are those ones going to do? Well, this is where quite an interesting little phenomenon happened, and that was the upshot of the vagabonds. Now, a vagabond is different to a vagrant. So you get charged with vagrancy. Well, a vagrant is someone who is homeless but lives in a localized area. Whereas a vagabond is also homeless, but travels around. They don't stay in one spot. So these groups of people would get together. We had people let out from these mental asylums, supposedly cured. They knew they weren't cured. We had people with disabilities. Other people who just didn't fit the regular norm lifestyle that other people wanted, with the house, the wife, and the kids. So they would join in with these groups and they would form a little gang, so to speak, and travel from city to city. Or I should say village to village, because it was the rural community where these vagabonds actually traveled around. Now, this suited the farmers in France because you had this traveling labor force that, one, was cheap. They had very few overheads, so they didn't need much. And when the work was over, well, then these vagabonds would move on to the next village. Now, if there wasn't much work around, these vagabonds would beg for food. And it was sort of like a bit of charity, I suppose, or perhaps social security, however you want to look at it. But once they got what they needed, they wouldn't stay. Again, they would move on to the next place and hopefully find employment there after they've got a little bit of food. The problem with these vagabonds is, like any organisation, any group that you know of, you will get a few bad apples amongst them. And yes, some vagabonds were terrible. They did some horrendous crimes. But because of that, locals would start getting suspicious. And if a vagabond crew were in your village and something bad happened, well, immediately suspicion would fall on them, because it could not be a local who has done this crime. In a similar way with Jack the Ripper, we see Londoners didn't want to think it was a local that could be terrorizing the streets. And so we understand, we don't like to think a regular person like you and I could commit some absolutely atrocious crimes, but as we know, it does happen. But still, we also understand the xenophobia. Someone foreign, someone you don't know, you're quick to believe that they could be capable of absolutely anything. And so, the vagabonds, during this Belle Epoque, were really struggling with trust issues of the people around. But sadly, some of those trust issues were justified, particularly with one vagabond. But we will get to that a bit later. First, we need to consider just some of the crimes. And as I say, viewer discretion is advised, but also I am not covering every victim here for quite a few reasons. It is really hard to do justice to all of the victims because we don't exactly know how many there were. Officially, there were 11. And many of the crimes were similar. But unfortunately, we know a little detail about quite a few of them. But also, if we just focused on those 11, well, we could be missing out on quite a few more, as we will bring out during this video. Therefore, I hope you understand I am focusing on just a few. But trust me, all the crimes during 1894 to 1897 were very similar in the method of operation and the things done to these poor people. We start on the 19th of May, 1894. And I believe the town was Beaurepaire. And I won't be listing all the locations either, and I'll be giving you where you can find more resources if you want to pinpoint where these events happened, but they were not all in the same area. But it started in this little town, Beaurepaire. There was a silk factory there, and there was a young girl, Eugenie. She was 21 years old. She was quite pretty. She was quite popular. Now, in a very small little village, the dating pool would have been very narrow, but she was doing quite well for herself. Never really without a boyfriend would be the way I would best describe it. And that's not a slight against this person at all. She was young, she was pretty, she was available, and she made good use of those situations. But working at the silk factory wasn't exactly a lucrative occupation. They said you would work about 14 hours a day for very, very little money, but in return you would get board and food. So you'd have a roof over your head and at least eating. So you didn't need much more. But still, they were really, really difficult hours. But it was on the night of the 19th of May in 1894. Eugenie stepped outside just to take a breath in the night hours. Well, she doesn't return to the factory. People start wondering, well, what's happened to Eugenie? So they go out and have a look, and they can't find her. But then a search begins, and someone sees sticking out of the bushes some feet. Upon further inspection, they find Eugenie. The autopsy showed that she had been strangled and then totally eviscerated in a very similar way to the victims of Jack the Ripper, except worse. Absolutely terrible mutilation done to this poor woman. Well, the locals are up in arms. They first go to Eugenie's last known boyfriend, and they arrest him. And apparently there was a little bit of conflict between them at one point because they weren't together at the time. But he had a rock solid alibi. He was nowhere near the area, but the police don't care. They're holding this bloke. They probably realised there was very little evidence against him. But then a former boyfriend as well, another one from further back. Apparently they had a dispute over a child. Now I cannot find any evidence if the child was ever born or what happened to it. But there was a paternity dispute apparently. So they're suggesting it could have been this Louis. He's gone and taken revenge out on her, so they arrest him. He also has a perfect alibi, but they're holding him in prison. And it is noted that this dispute between Eugenie and Louis just was a much ado about nothing, apparently, and was all resolved. Regardless, he's now still sitting in prison. Then another Louis, a different one, a younger bloke, they found his watch near the scene. So they pick him up too. He also just had an alibi, probably not as rock solid as the others, but he said, look, I actually lost my watch a couple of days ago. Thank you very much for finding it. But they hold him in prison. Absolutely no evidence. Oddly, someone handed in a bloody knife to the police, and they look at it and say, well, thanks, and throw it in the bin. Bit odd. Needless to say, the police were totally lost as to who could have committed this crime. Yet the locals said, we saw a strange looking vagabond hanging around. He had a scarred face. He was creeping a lot of people out. The police don't give too much credit to this. They probably think the locals are just saying it because they don't want it to be one of them. But they have no evidence. They really have no idea. But it took a petition by the locals after 45 days of these other three poor blokes being in prison to get them out. And the police have to release them because, well, they've got no evidence. But the story of this strange vagabond with a scarred face wasn't unique. An older female sheep herder said that she was followed by someone that matched that description, and she ran away and she managed to get away. Two other women, separate incidents, described the same bloke. One said she managed to call to her husband, and when the husband started coming towards her out in the rural area, this stranger took off. Another woman said she was being stalked, saw this bloke in the woods watching her. So she starts talking loudly as if she's got company. And the guy disappears. And just as a side note, yes, this is not a new phenomenon for women. Like if they even want to go walking or jogging, they have to be hyper vigilant because some crazy nutter could be lurking in the shadows. And us blokes probably don't understand that fully. I'll say that I don't understand it fully, but it is quite a sad indictment on society that still has to happen. But these women were going through exactly the same thing as many do today. But then we now jump forward to the 20th of November in 1894. I believe it's Louis Vache. He was only a 13-year-old young boy. Now he was found in an abandoned barn. He also had been strangled. He also had been cut up. And he was also sexually assaulted after death. That is absolutely diabolically disgusting. But a local farmer found Louis. The police immediately suspect this bloke. Because they go, mate, how did you find this body? This is an abandoned barn. What were you doing looking for it? And also, your shoes. You've got wooden soled shoes. There's wooden soled shoe prints in this barn. So we think it's you. And he gets arrested. Now this farmer Charles probably didn't have any real way of explaining how he found the body. He's held in prison for quite some time. But the stupid part about it is that wooden soled shoes, everyone in the area had them. So the fact you found wooden soled shoe prints would not have raised an issue at all. And after quite a few weeks in prison, again, they have no evidence of who could have committed this crime. So fortunately, Charles is released. And yes, Charles definitely was innocent of that particular crime. Now, it's important to note that in rural parts of France, many women were being attacked, and the description they gave was a vagabond-looking person with a scarred face. It was too uncanny that the same description was being given, and this assailant, forcing himself on many of these poor women, some managed to fight him off. And in every instance, one particular instance where a woman managed to raise the alarm, screamed, threw rocks until two blokes turned up. And the moment these blokes turned up, this guy took off and got away. This was happening throughout this entire time before the 12th of May, 1895. And this time it was a young girl, Augustine, and she was only 17 years old. Now her family were in poverty. They were working on farms, not necessarily owning farms, but working on them. They had a large family, and Augustine's older sister had moved to a nearby village. But now her older sister had fallen sick, and the parents said, well, look, we can't go and tend to her. She sent a message saying, can you come and look after me? But we just can't go. Like, if we don't work, we may not eat tonight. So they asked Augustine, could she go? And so she takes off to the nearby village, which was only like 5 kilometers or 3 miles away, with a little dog for protection. Well, she was then found along the road in between these villages in a thicket, with also the same attack done to her as was done to Eugenie back at Beau Repair. This really, really caused a stir. But people who had been walking that road that day had seen a bloke with a scarred face. Oddly also, the description given was wooden soled shoes. This description was matching every other attack. And so a bit of a be on the lookout was put out for this person But the local people believed a businessman in town was responsible, and they said he'd succumbed to a disease known as erotic insanity, and he attacked this girl. And that became the general consensus. And the police are like, we got nothing on this bloke. We can't go and arrest him just because you think that. And then the locals said, you're just protecting the rich and we're going to do something about it. So on the day, not long after the funeral of Augustine, they held a bit of a memorial or call to action even about the crime. And they said, we are going to get justice. And so they're marching to this businessman's house, and the police had to head them off. They were going to lynch him, and that is something that happened in France quite a lot. But this businessman, well, he took off. But they actually tried to chase him, caught up with the carriage, but he wasn't in there. Somehow he escaped, and he was never going to go back there because he realized these people were after him, but he didn't do the crime. But the local people were getting more and more stirred up about attacks happening in their small communities. And as I mentioned, I'm not covering every crime, but in between May and the next one I'm going to talk about in August of 1895, a young shepherd boy out on his own was assaulted in a very similar way to the one previous, and also sexually assaulted after death, as well as an older woman who was found in a home by a daughter, and she was totally, mutilated and also assaulted after death. Very confronting. And we can understand the feelings of people wanting the police to catch this person. It was on the 24th of August, 1895. A 68-year-old woman was found by her son inside their house, assaulted in the same way as the previous ones. But it was only a week later, on August 31st, in a town not too far away of 1895, that a young kid, Victor, he was 15 or 16, depending on the reports you read. He had a very sad situation in life. Yes, born to very poverty-stricken parents. They had quite a large family, but his father died when he was 12. His mother had no way of supporting everyone, so she became what was known in London at the time an unfortunate. Started having to sell herself on the street. Well, Child Protection Services back then took the child away, but he managed to be doing okay, but took on work looking over some cattle. And normally he would go out with a whole range of other boys who were also doing that job, but he went out half an hour early this day. But when the others got out to look after their cattle, they found him up against a thicket. Then they realised he'd been attacked and assaulted. Well, all the farmers in the area were saying that a vagabond-looking person with a scarred face had been begging for food, and many of them turned him away. And they also described the other features very, very well, and the police actually saw someone, and they picked him up. But it was mistaken identity, but he resembled the description very well. But no, he could not have done the crime. But now the police are starting to look for this particular individual. Now, it could go on. Between the 21st of September to 1895 to the 19th of June, 1897, at least 5 other victims were found that matched this method of operation perfectly. But as I said, and as we'll look, there could have been way, way more. But here, the mystery was, how could, of one bloke with the scarred face, be seen all over France perpetrating the same type of crime? But could it just be that all these little villages are talking and the Chinese whispers are spread all across the rural communities? Be on the lookout for this vagabond with a scarred face. Perhaps he didn't exist. Maybe these crimes were done in isolation. Well, enter Emile Fouquet. Now, it said he became a magistrate of one of these little provinces, want of a better term. I don't know exactly what they're called there. But a magistrate really wasn't, as we think today, sitting there as a judge. They were more of an investigator of crimes in the area. And one of these little shepherd boys, that crime had occurred in his jurisdiction, and he wanted it solved. So he really looked into it and noted the wounds, the way the attack was occurred, and also the description of the stranger that people had seen in the area. And then in his readings, he came across another victim in a neighbouring area that matched the MO of the case he was looking at. And then he's seeing other cases popping up: strangulation, total mutilation, the assaults after death. And interestingly, here is a point that the police there didn't have great communication between the little villages and stuff. It wasn't one centralised body that was sharing information, but they did make good records. And because of those records, he was able to find out that the description of some strange person hovering around was matching all the time. But even he was asking himself, how could someone, the same person, traverse the entire country committing the same type of crime and not be caught? Well, then an odd event happened in 1897. A woman was in the rural area watching her two kids at play. And then this scarred-faced, vagabond-looking person came out of the bushes and tried to assault her. But she fought and screamed. And what this person doing the attack didn't know was the husband and older son were actually nearby. And they came running. And a big scuffle ensued, to the point where neighbours heard and neighbouring farmers also came running, and they subdued the man and locked him up in a barn. They then called the gendarme to come and arrest this bloke. It took 6 hours for that policeman to turn up. And it said that during that time, the man inside this barn where they'd locked him in was hurling quite a lot of abuse at anyone that would come near the barn. But the police arrest him and decide to lock him up for 3 months for public indecency. But Fouquet, he heard of this. He got the description. It matched everyone else's. So he made a request to have that prisoner sent to his jurisdiction. And now, here is Emile Fouquet looking across the table at a vagabond-looking person with a scarred face. Had he just caught the French Ripper? The man sitting at the table was Joseph Vache. And he said, look, I've had a tough life, and I'll tell you my story. But yeah, it has been really difficult for me. I spent a month in prison not long ago for a similar charge, but they let me out because, I'm a good bloke. And this is just a misunderstanding. I really wasn't assaulting her. And these blokes just overreacted. That's why I carried on the way I did. But let me tell you who I am. So he begins to unravel his life story to Emile Fouquet. He was born in 1869. His father, Pierre, and his mother, Rosalie, were actually quite old to have children. Pierre was 59 when Vache was born. And Rosalie was 44, but she passed away when Vache was only about 12 years old. Now, he had quite a few older siblings. In fact, Rosalie was not Pierre's first wife. It was his second or perhaps even third wife, and he'd had children before. But these were the youngest, and I say these because Vache had a twin. Now, it's debatable whether it was a boy or a girl twin. I actually believe it was a boy, Eugene. Some people say it was Eugenie. Now, that Eugene and Eugenie name was quite common back in France in the day, but I believe it was a brother. I believe and also that it was an identical twin for a reason that I will get into later. But unfortunately, at 8 months old, one of the older siblings had dropped some bread into the cot, and it was Eugene, or Eugenie, ate the bread and choked and sadly passed away. So that would have been a tragic event. But Pierre was struggling to deal with young Vache, young Joseph. He sent him out to look after some cattle one day and came across him just to experiment, because this is what you do, breaking the cattle's legs to see what would happen. Now, it's understandable why Pierre, who is now in his early 70s at this stage, had to send Vache off to a monastery, basically, to get an education, because he could not control this young lad. And I will say that it is disturbing when people begin harming animals at a young age. It's just too uncanny how many of them end up doing worse crimes later in life if that behavior is not curbed and trying to get to the root cause of why you are doing that. It is just rather disturbing. But now it's said at this Christian college, I don't know what else to call it, Maris Brothers, I believe it was, but anyway, he's being taught by the priests and so forth, but they expel him after a couple of years for inappropriate sexual behavior with other students. Now, I have to ask here, what would appropriate sexual behavior between students back then have been? Don't know, but no, he got expelled for being a bit on the deviant side, we would have to say. And mind you, this is the story that Vache is giving to Fouquet. Now, this is not part of what he said in this statement, apparently, but there were other accusations even throughout all his life, whether he tried to attack and assault young boys, young girls, as he was growing up himself. None of that was ever proven, but the accusations were out there, and I think it's safe to say that they probably were true. Now, sometime here, during all of this, his father passed away in 1889. Not that I think it really would have bothered Vache that much, because he actually never mentions the passing of his father. As we'll see, there's certain events in his life that he does bring up that he said impacted him. But he started getting involved with a bit of a loose living in his, obviously, early 20s, late teens, hanging out with unfortunates, paying for a bit of company, and he contracted a venereal disease. And because of that, they had to do a treatment where they did a little bit of surgery in the private areas. Now, it didn't impact him that much physically, but he says it had an impact on him, as also we will look at a bit later. But then he joins the military. Now, the military life was perfect for him. Here is a bloke who needed structure. Here's a bloke who needed discipline. And he said he thrived. This was the time of his life. And there was a promotion coming up where he could move up the ranks a little bit. And he is absolutely shocked when the promotion goes to a different soldier. But yeah, he took it on the chin and decided, well, I'm just going to put my nose to the grindstone and prove they made the wrong decision, and the next opportunity that comes up, I'm going to take it. Well, actually, no, that's not how he handled the situation. He went totally off his rocker. He threw stuff. He abused people. He wanted to fight basically everybody, and then took a blade to his throat and tried to end it all. Yep, that's how you handle disappointment. Anyway, they decided to give him leave. So it was called a dismissal, but he wasn't actually kicked out of the army. So I'd say it was a suspension. And they said, mate, after you recover from this, because he didn't succeed chopping his own throat and ending his life. But oddly enough, some people have, so it is possible. So how determined he was, I don't know. But anyway, he's on this suspension, and he's runs across a person who is very central to the rest of his life story. And this is in 1893. He meets this young girl, Louise. Now, she'd moved to the village where the military camp was and where he was still sort of hanging out. And it was love at first sight for him. So he goes up to her. Now, she looks at him and it's a bit standoffish. It's like, because the vagabonds were around, remember? You just couldn't always trust strangers. But he pulls out his military papers and says, look, I'm good. I'm trustworthy. And it's interesting that the military papers did seem to carry a lot of weight in most people's minds. But that settled Louise down, and she said, well, this is great. Well, let's go off on a date. Now, it's safe to say here that in Vache's mind, this date went absolutely brilliantly. And he now knows this is the woman of his dreams. And he, in perhaps the most poetic language I've ever heard in a marriage proposal, I don't know if this is exactly right, whether he got down on one knee or not, but he says, will you marry me? And if you betray me, I will kill you. Yep, that's how to win friends and influence people. Like, just, what would you, if you're on the end of that proposal, are you now going, oh, this is great, let's go off and get eloped right now? I think it's safe to say that Louise backed off a little. She's just like, I'm not so sure. We might give it a little bit more time. And she distanced herself. But he was persistent. He wasn't going to give up. And he managed to convince her, after that charming proposal, to go to a dance with him. Now, on the way to the dance, another bloke just has a "G'day, how you going?" to Louise, and Vache punches on. Gets into a fight with this bloke for talking to his woman. Well, I think that was enough for Louise. So then she actually leaves the town. So she'd moved to this town. She was trying to make new friends, but she moved back home to her parents and told Vache, look, my parents wouldn't allow it. You're not the right person, and so they're banning me from seeing you. Nice way of saying, thanks, buddy, see you later. But he didn't get that message. So Vache decides, well, I am now going to go and find Louise. No, forget that. I'm going to go find the parents. I'm going to say, why won't you let me date your daughter? I'm a good bloke. So he goes there. The parents, no doubt, were just like, what on earth is going on here? They basically told him to just rack off, mate. And he goes, well, I'm going to go find Louise. So he hunts her down. And yes, I would say hunt her down, as we're going to see, at her workplace. And she comes out and she's just livid now. She's like, what don't you understand? I am not going to go against what my parents are saying. And what is more, I don't want anything to do with you. I mean, have you seen yourself? You're a crazy person. So again, Vache then accepts it. Finally realizes that relationship is not going to work out. Well, again, if only he had have reacted that way, but no. See, he's got a gun, but he doesn't have any ammunition. So not only has he had time now to walk away and calm down from this rejection, but he goes to a place that sells ammunition and says, I need a few bullets, thank you very much. Goes back to Louise's place of work, points the gun in her face and shoots 3 times. Then turns the gun on himself and shoots himself in the head twice. So how is he having this conversation with Vache? Because we'd have to say, like, surely now he's ended his life. That's the second time he's tried to do so. Well, unbeknownst to Vache, where he bought the bullets, the bloke who was selling him thought, well, I don't need to pack the casings full of gunpowder, because that's just a waste, and that's where the money is. And I can sell more bullets with less input by only like stacking a little bit in there. So they were almost blanks. Almost. They did break a couple of Louise's teeth, and she got a couple of grazes on each temple, it said. So this Vache appears not to be a very good shot, even at point-blank range. But yeah, she was a bit injured, but not too bad. But he did get 2 bullets lodged into his head. One apparently near his ear, stayed there permanently. But he's just gone out onto the street, stumbling around, falls over. He gets arrested, obviously for attempted murder on Louise, but they send him to an asylum for treatment. Now, the first asylum he is sent to, because it's not the only one, was pretty hard. I would say it's more a prison. It probably would make the Broadmoor one mentioned in the Jack the Ripper saga look like a little bit of a holiday camp, because it more didn't have health workers but guards, and your room really wasn't a room, it was a prison cell, and you were in shackles. But the really odd detail here is he's allowed to write letters, and they let him write letters to Louise. Why? Every fortnight you can send a letter, so he writes to her in such glowing terms, and he is being nice in them, telling him how what's going on. He actually mentions, though, that the guards want to kill him. Don't know the truthfulness of that, but perhaps it was true. But he said, I'm just surrounded by criminals and nut jobs. Well, that part probably was true. Yet he does get convicted of this attempted murder, basically, but they said, look, that's because you are insane. But instead of staying in this basic lockbox of an asylum, they send him to a much, much better facility. And this one, it's incredible. Oh, and just as a side point here, Louise was not receiving the letters herself because the father managed to intercept them. And he's like, she doesn't need this torment, and good on him. Unfortunately, that is not the end of that story. But Vache now finds himself in this really, really good facility. And this facility, it's like a dormitory. You do have your own room. You're not locked up. You're not shackled. And it's actually got males and females in the same facility. Different wings where you sleep and everything. But you can get together during the day and associate together and have conversations. It gave interesting treatments there. So this was cutting edge in the day. They gave him some opium, so like start drug therapy. I mean, they still do that today too. They did some type of hydrotherapy. I'm not sure if it was waterboarding. I really don't understand. The next one though, and I think this one is important. They used leeches, yes, to suck some blood out. And I say pin that because I think that particular detail is important. But mostly, and I think this is what was helpful, they had conversations. They had people, therapists there, where you could talk things out. Now, it's said, after 3 months, Vache's cured. So he's telling Fouquet, they let me out, and I was perfectly fine. But I was a bit lost. I didn't know what to do with myself. I tried reconnecting with Louise, but that just didn't happen. So then I ended up having to walk the streets, and I joined in with the vagabonds. And yeah, times have been tough, as I mentioned. I was in prison twice now. Total misunderstandings. But when people don't trust me, I'm able to pull out my military papers to show I served the country. So I didn't do all these crimes that you're talking about. It wasn't me. But he was released from that first asylum on the 1st of April 1894. And no, this is not an April Fool's Day joke. That was the date he was released. And it was only 6 weeks after that the attacks began occurring. But now our investigator, Fouquet, how would you be if you're sitting there? You've heard this story. You know the bloke had just not long got out of the asylum as all the attacks began occurring. You'd be stunned. Maybe a little bit thrilled. Because perhaps you now know you've definitely got your man. He had the look. And he's just explained how he could have committed all these crimes all over France. Because he was a vagabond. He was in with that crew that just travelled around. But Vache was not confessing though. And without a confession, it was going to be almost impossible to get a conviction because there was no hard evidence against him. Even though, there's a little detail here too, when he was released from the asylum, they handed him back his gun, his knife, and a club. And many of the victims had been beaten severely as well. Now, Emile Fouquet and the next person in the investigation we're going to discuss are two people who are very much the pioneers of forensic science for various reasons. Fouquet, he was the one that managed to actually profile the French Ripper. So he had an idea of the person he was looking for and also managed to coordinate all the information and pin all these different reports from around the country all together. But now he needed to get this conviction. But he knows that if he pushes Vache, he'll clam up. So he tries a different tactic. He says, look, sorry, buddy, I have made a mistake. Look, I've done this. You're not the first bloke I've brought in asking about these crimes. But look, I can't let you go yet, but I'm actually writing a book on the vagabonds and what life is like for you blokes. So could you just tell me about your travels, where you've gone over the last few years? Well, Vache lightens up. He's like, well, this is great. And you know, it's funny, people love talking about themselves. And when they get talking, they sometimes don't realize that they're walking themselves into a trap. But Vache begins detailing his travels, pinpointing where he was and when he was at those places. And Fouquet is sitting there, ticking off each crime. He was there. He was there. Yep, and another one. Well, Fouquet, he got Vache to spill the beans. Yes, to confess to being the French Ripper by probably channeling Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple all in one. He used the tactic of bluffing. Yes, he said, mate, we've got all the evidence on you. You can't get away with this. You better do something for yourself right now and tell us the truth. Now, I would say in this moment, Vache probably thought, yeah, they've got me. But how? How can I manage to make this better for myself? How can I get back to that beautiful dormitory, that great facility where maybe I could live out my days in a bit of luxury? I won't even have to walk the streets anymore, begging for food. How humiliating that was. So I believe he now is lining up the insanity defense. Yeah, I did the crimes, which he admits to and goes into great detail, and his detail is disturbing, but he also says that it was the rage in me. And he even starts with Eugenie, the silk worker. And he's saying, I had felt this poison in my blood that had to get out. And after doing that crime to that poor 21-year-old woman, it settled me down for a little while until the poison built back up. And that's why I go back to the leeches, because back in the day, it was thought that the poison's in your blood, you've got to get it out. And I believe he was using that to say he was insane. Now, Fouquet knew this bloke was the guilty one. But he also now knew that if he could prove himself to be insane, he might go to that asylum, be cured, and be back out onto the street. So what could they do to at least keep this man behind bars? Well, enter Dr. Lassagne. And he was the other person who really put forth forensic science on the path it is today. See, back when he started making improvements, autopsies in France and probably in other places occurred anywhere. If they found someone dead in a house, they'd do the autopsy on the kitchen table. And he's like, that is not good. We need standard operating procedure on how we can do these things clinically so we can get the results that we need. So he organized autopsies and he did many other things, and he did a lot of psychology. And it has been stated that if these two blokes had been on the case in Whitechapel in 1888, Jack the Ripper would have been caught within a week, because they would have nailed this. And maybe, I'm not having a go at the policing in London at the time, but maybe with these two blokes there, they would have had a better result than they did. Now, I won't talk about all the interactions that he had, but he said, like, I heard voices in my head, and Lassagne sort of believed that he did have these audible hallucinations, like the voices in the head. That obviously can't be proven, but that could have just been a ploy for the insanity plea. But he did, Vache that is, give the reasons as to why he was insane. Firstly, his twin dying at a young age. And that's why I suggest it probably was an identical twin brother, because those identical twins do seem to have a strange connection, and that would have made sense if he was using that as an excuse. He said also the surgery he received as a young man, that affected his mental stability. He also said he was bitten by a dog, which I didn't mention before, when he was young, and had to get a rabies shot. He doesn't remember being bitten by the dog, but he remembers the shot, and he actually said it was the immunization that gave him the poison in his blood and sent him totally off the rails. He said not getting the promotion in the military really affected his self-esteem, and then the unrequited love with Louise, which he had all his life. He was constantly sending her letters, even on his travels all around France. He said, I just couldn't overcome that. And then he said, and he felt like he was doing God's work. Yes, he was strongly religious, involved in the Catholic religion, and I don't think they'd probably want to claim him, but regardless, he really did think that he was on that path, and the voices in his head was God telling him to do that terrible, terrible crimes. But the one thing he really tried to pin his defense of insanity on was the rage that he could not control because he was insane. And that is the one thing that probably put the nail in the coffin, because Dr. Lassagne, he actually said, no, that's wrong. You weren't in rage when you did these attacks. You're a predator. You were a stalker. You were opportunistic. Because if a bloke turned up, you took off. You never went after some big burly bloke that could fight back. You targeted your victims, and you targeted the ones that you thought, sometimes wrongly, but you thought you could overpower easily. So no, you're not full of rage. You are just a pathetic, cowardly, opportunistic, low-life individual. So on Dr. Lassagne's recommendation, he was tried as a sane person, found guilty, and he was executed on December 31st, 1898, by the guillotine. He was aged 29. And in true form, Vache took this standing up like a man. Again, no. He had to be dragged to the gallows. Literally, he wasn't walking anywhere, and some reports say he was screaming the whole time. Probably a fitting end for the French Ripper. But now, in summary, there is heaps about this story that I did not include, and if you want more information, there is a great book out. It's titled The Killer of Little Shepherds. Now, I don't like that title because it wasn't just these young shepherd boys that he attacked. He attacked older women, other women, and some of his crimes, which he says happened, were just a mind-boggling. He believed in himself that he could exercise his right over any woman that he wanted if he felt the need. And it said that he did that quite a lot throughout France. Not necessarily murdering everyone, but taking advantage of women against their will. Even though we saw what happened to some of the little boys that he attacked too, I would suggest that he just did whatever he pleased and could not handle rejection at all. His official victim count stands at 11. Fouquet, he researched many and he followed all the paths that Vache said he went, and he reckoned he could pin him for 27 crimes. It only took one conviction to have this bloke executed. Other people have estimated his victim count at over 100 because there are unsolved crimes very similar to these around the same time in the rural areas. I would suggest it may be somewhere between that. Who exactly would know? So there seem to be big gaps between some of his crimes, and then, like ones in very, very quick succession. So who's to say that they weren't happening all the way through? So I could see 50 being quite viable. Now, Dr. Lassagne is very interesting in this too, because he deemed him sane. Yet, it said he was 50-50 on it, even his papers. He wasn't sure. And we can understand that. Like, you would think, possibly, this bloke could not have been sane. There had to be something seriously wrong to commit those types of crimes. Because ourselves, we just cannot imagine how someone could perpetrate that against anybody, yet do it for so long and so often as well. Yet, I do believe Dr. Lassagne knew two things. One, the system at the time would have let him out. And you couldn't have someone like that out on the street. Because if he is insane, they're not going to be able to cure him. If he is sane, that's absolutely terribly frightening. But the other thing is, I don't think an injustice was done if he even was insane, because the people would have lynched him. Had they have not done the execution, I think the people would have gone into that asylum, dragged him out, and done it themselves. The French people aren't averse to that type of behaviour. So regardless, I don't think Vache had too much more time on the earth. And as it said, there was 3,500 people turned up to the execution as well. People wanted to see justice done, and considering the crimes, we can understand why. But what if he wasn't caught? Could you imagine the stories that would have come up about this vagabond, scarred-looking person, the myths that would have been created, the suspect list that would have happened, and somehow he would have risen to some almost mythical perpetrator of crimes, rather than seeing him as he was, this opportunistic, cowardly perpetrator. And I link that to Jack the Ripper. His crimes weren't as atrocious as Vache's. Didn't go on, apparently, for as long as Vache's. Yet because he was never caught, look at the hysteria surrounding those events in Whitechapel. It's just an interesting comparison. And I would suggest, when Jack the Ripper does get unmasked, we will see a very similar person. A weak, opportunistic, probably slightly mentally ill, cowardly person. Now, I know that was a massively heavy one, and probably a fairly long video as well, and I had to cut heaps out because this could have been a series all by itself. But I really didn't want to spend too much more time in the life of Joseph Vache. Just even looking at some of the things that he did is very, very disturbing. But let me know what you think. Do you think justice was done in this case? Do you think maybe with better treatment earlier on, and perhaps intervention earlier on in his life, these atrocities could have been avoided? I really don't know. But as always, thank you so much for listening or watching wherever you're doing it. Show some support either with a comment, like, subscribe or follow. I'm Owen, this is the Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.